MPs have delivered a scathing assessment of the British government's evacuation of Afghanistan last year. The Foreign Affairs Committee said Afghan allies and British soldiers had been let down by what they called deep failures of leadership. Their report accuses ministers of having a total absence of a plan and calls for the resignation of the Foreign Office's top civil servant, a man called Sir Philip Barton, who stayed on holiday as Kabul fell. Paul Adams reports.
The West's withdrawal from Kabul was chaotic and, for vast numbers of Afghans desperate to leave, profoundly traumatic. It was also, MPs say, a betrayal of Britain's allies, a catastrophic failure of intelligence.
Oh, I do apologise. Suddenly that VT ended in the middle, but it's a good job we can talk now to Conservative MP and Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Tom Tugendhat. Mr Tugendhat, thank you very much for talking to us. I'm afraid we weren't able to bring our audience all the details of the report, so I wonder if you could draw the main points out for us.
Of course, I'm happy to help. Look, the points that we made, and let's not forget this is a cross-party committee, Labour, Conservative, Scottish National Party members on it, was to point out that at a time when there was quite clearly a crisis in Afghanistan and actually a crisis for the United Kingdom as well, as there were many British people or people who depended on us in Afghanistan who needed to get out and needed help. Just at that moment, there was a complete failure of leadership in the Foreign Office. We saw the senior leadership absent and the ability to execute a plan very severely lacking, largely because there was no plan. And this is despite the fact that intelligence warnings and indeed political warnings had been pretty clear for the previous 18 months or so. You know, it wasn't a secret that the United States was negotiating with the Taliban. It wasn't a secret that both President Trump and then President Biden were planning to withdraw troops. None of that was a secret. And yet, on the day that Kabul fell, it appeared pretty clear to us that there had been almost no planning done by anybody except for PGHQ, the military, who were ready to evacuate people, but they were struggling because they didn't know, because the Foreign Office hadn't told them who to evacuate.
But that is extraordinary. No planning, you're saying?
That, I'm afraid, is the conclusion of the report. Very, very little planning had been done. So the military had done the planning for the evacuation, that's which they'd done and refreshed on several different occasions in the months earlier. But the FCDO didn't know who were the entitled people, who were those who had stood by us, who were those who had risked their lives serving alongside people like me in Kabul and in Helmand. You know, when I was working in the National Security Council in Kabul, I worked alongside many Afghans who risked their lives to try and help build a better Afghanistan. They knew the dangers they were taking, and many people were encouraged to work with us on the promise that, you know, this was a huge risk, but if it went wrong, then we'd stand by them. And the same is true in Helmand. But sadly, in the days after that August disaster, what we saw instead was death squads looking for them and murdering them and their families in homes in places like Lashkar and Kabul. And I'm afraid that is a very, very serious failing.
Why do you think very little planning had been done?
Well, I'm afraid that is something that we struggle to answer. All we can identify is that it wasn't.
And is that down to the Foreign Secretary or the Foreign Office's top civil servant?
It's a combination. Look, and the Foreign Secretary has already had to go and has been moved. So now we're looking at the other officials who were responsible. And the reality is that, you know, the Permanent Under-Secretary of State, as he's called, the head of the British Foreign Office, isn't there just to execute the wishes of whichever politician happens to be in place. They're there to lead an organisation. They're there like a general in charge of an army. They're there in order to drive change and demonstrate the ethos that we expect of British diplomats. You know, the example, by the way, that was demonstrated by many, many junior diplomats throughout the organisation, those who stayed, you know, 24/7 in Whitehall looking through lists of names trying to help, those who flew incredibly courageously into Kabul, those who went and stayed in, you know, those who were in the embassy but stayed at the airport in order to help. You know, there were very, very many impressive demonstrations of the courage and integrity we expect of British diplomats here, and of course of soldiers and Border Force staff and other Home Office officials. This is a tragedy of failure, not of the staff who were employed to do it.
As you say, the Foreign Secretary was moved. He's now the Deputy Prime Minister. Some might see that as a promotion. In terms of Sir Philip Barton, this senior civil servant, he's still in his job. Why?
Well, we're the committee. We, I'm afraid, don't have the power to hire and fire. What we can do is express our views. And as
I know you don't have the power to hire and fire. I'm asking you, why do you think he could still be there?
Well, I'm afraid that is a question for the Foreign Secretary. What we've done is we've expressed our own view, and as I say, this is not my view. This is the view of a committee of 11 members of Parliament, some Labour, some SNP, some Conservative. And we've just simply said that we don't have confidence in him because at the time when we were looking into what happened and trying to understand how decisions were made, and yes, they were fraught, yes, they were difficult, and I'm not pretending that they weren't, nobody is. But at that moment when things were going really wrong, very difficult decisions were made, and we tried to get to the bottom of how those decisions were made so that we can make sure that such decisions, made in a more structured and better way, we get better answers in the future. And I'm afraid we didn't get the clarity of response that I think the British people should expect of those people who work for us.
Right. And when you were taking evidence from Sir Philip, did you feel he was giving you the truth?
Well, as I say, we didn't feel that we got the clarity of response.
What does that mean?
I mean, frankly, we didn't get straight answers.
Right. You mean he was evasive, or you didn't feel he was being honest?
Well, different members of the committee had different feelings on it. The report speaks for itself. We felt that some of the responses were designed to put us off the mark.